How many of you like mowing the yard? How many of you love mowing the yard? How many of you wish you could mow the yard right now and it's just been too cold and too wet and you haven't been able to mow the yard? How many of you remember mowing the yard when you were a kid? Did you guys have those fun riding lawnmowers too, or did you have to push? The push ones. I had a couple riding lawnmowers. In fact, I had one was a nice little riding mower. Then I had this tractor. My dad had a tractor, an old B and it had the undercarriage because we had an orchard and a big garden and 8 acres that we had to mow, and it was a lot of mowing. In fact, you would mow one day and then mow the next day just to hopefully get all of it done. And then you'd have just maybe a couple days break. And pretty quick, you're going to be mowing all over again. Anybody remember that? You're just mowing constantly over and over. And I remember for me that the cool thing was I had these tractors and riding lawnmowers, and I thought the objective of mowing was to see how fast each gear could go. You can see some of you are laughing. You know exactly what I'm talking about. How fast can I make this mower go? How quick can I get this job done? And how much excitement that was, how fast I could make those things go. Now, I think the objective and the purpose of mowing was different in my mind than it was in my dad's mind. Because I know my dad would come home. You might know where this is going. My dad would come home and look at the job that I did. And he'd look at the paths that I had cut, and he'd see some strips that were like, mohawks going down the middle of the, you know what I'm talking about? This whole line that I missed, or taking a corner too sharp, and I missed this around the edge, and it just wasn't done very well. As a child, did any of the rest of you remember dad or mom saying, go back out there and do it again? You didn't do it right the first time, so get back out there and do it again. I think we encounter Jonah in this particular passage where God is saying, get back out there and do it again, because you didn't do it the way that it needed to be done, and you kind of messed it up along the way. We've encountered this passage, and we find in it that it says that Nineveh was a great city. A great city, in fact, so great that it was 3 days' journey across it. Now, let me point out, how long do you think it would take to walk across Des Moines? Probably not 3 days. No. This whole concept of 3 days is realistically, it's more symbolic. It's intended to say if you were going about it leisurely or enjoying your way, stopping at the homes that you knew along the way, maybe 3 days. But it really means these 3 days are more symbolic. How many days did Jonah spend in the belly of the whale again? 3. How many days was Jesus in the tomb? 3. How many times did Jesus pray in the garden? 3. How many years in ministry? 3. This symbol of 3 means it's a divine perfection. It's a number that indicates something that's important to God, that has value and purpose to God. And in fact, when you read the Old Testament, when you read Jonah, it says this exceedingly great city. The Hebrew indicates that it's not just huge. What it really means is it's very important. That this city itself is of great importance to God. Now, we encounter a problem here because this city was not important to Jonah. This city was the bottom of the barrel. This city were the people that Jonah would rather just see destroyed, killed. He was kind of excited when he heard that God was going to wipe the city out. He was good with that, but he didn't think that the city was very important. But God did. And in fact, I think we can say that we see the importance of the city of Nineveh when we begin to understand that he's talking about this exceedingly great city that Nineveh is, and the 3 days journey around it. In fact, we see what's going to happen, and we know that Nineveh is going to get saved. I think that Nineveh was so important to God that he actually intended Nineveh to be a foreshadowing of the salvation that all of humanity would receive through Jesus Christ. Nineveh is this city that offers us hope and helps us to understand and believe what Jesus did for us to bring us salvation, just like Jonah brought salvation to the Ninevites. But let me get this straight again. Jonah kind of was miserable. Jonah was a rotten prophet. Jonah really didn't know what he was doing, and even when he thought he did it wrong. He's unwilling, and he shows up in Nineveh, let's just say vomit covered, because he was just spit out by a whale, and very unwilling, maybe a little grumpy. I think we'd all be a little grumpy if we got vomited out by a whale. And then he walks part way into the city, and he gives a one-line prophecy. One line. Jonah says, hey, 40 days and you will be overthrown. That's it. It kind of gives you the heart of Jonah. Like, I really don't care about you at all. 40 days, you're overthrown. I don't care about you. You're nothing. You're not worth or not valuable, not anything. 40 days, and that's all I can put up with you. 40 days and you're overthrown. Boy, that's an exciting prophet. Anybody want to hear one of those preach? Jonah didn't care about the city. It's kind of like me doing my mowing as a kid. I didn't really care about the lawn. It was kind of like, how fast could I get the rider to go? How quick could I cut that corner? But God thought the city was important. Like my dad thought that the lawn should be cut right and look nice. Even though Jonah messed it up, and even though God told Jonah to get back there, do it again, even though you ran away the first time, he tried to completely avoid the job, and then even when he did it halfway. Jonah didn't understand the importance of Nineveh, nor do I think he even understood the significance of the words that came out of his mouth. How many of you have ever said something and had somebody else interpret it completely different? How many of you, this is a regular occurrence at home? You think you said something, or you think you meant this, but it became this, right? I think Jonah said something that he intended to say, you're going to be overthrown. But I think the people heard God's voice in a very different way, because the word that he uses here when he says, you will be overthrown, the word in the Hebrew, actually, I'm going to spell it for you because Hannah says it sounds a little too questionable if I speak it. It's Hawfak. Hoff, like that. Like a falcon, kind of, sort of, in the Hebrew. But what it means is, it does mean overthrown. And in fact, it has reference and connection to Sodom and Gomorrah, where God literally destroyed them. But it also has connection that goes deeper, that it means that there's a possibility of a change, that in fact there can be a change of heart or a transformation that takes place. And I believe Jonah said, you're going to be destroyed, but they heard, you must be transformed. You need a new heart. You need a new spirit within you. I'm sure some of you have heard a similar story. I've heard many. And we've experienced enough tragedy in our community as of late, but specifically a challenge for some of the high school age suicides. And I've heard story after story of high school students who've gone to school with the intent that today's my last day. But then they encounter someone who said something simple like, thanks for being my math partner. Or picking up their books and saying, I'll see you tomorrow. Something so simple, just that indicated compassion or love or care. And they changed their mind. They go home and they didn't even just hear the words of that person, but they heard the compassion of God speaking through them, saying, "You are important to me." Just like Nineveh is important to God, the people around us that feel broken or lost or worthless, they're important to God. Maybe we should begin asking ourselves the questions inside. Who is it that God cares about that I devalue? Or that I don't take time to notice? I think people heard God's voice through Jonah's broken and angry words. How often I hear people say, "Well, I can't really be a good Christian. I can't invite somebody to church. I can't share my faith because I haven't got it all right yet. I don't understand it all. I'm not good enough." And I say, look at some of these prophets. Look at some of these people in Scripture and say, you don't have to have it all right. You don't have to do everything perfect, because none of them did. They're all messed up, and yet the Word of God worked through them to bring transformation and hope and life. Jonah's miserable half effort still accomplished what God wanted to take place. The people went out, they put on sackcloth, they sat in ash, and it says, in fact, that they actually prevented their animals from eating because they were all repentant and they were wanting to restore their relationship with God. They believed, it says they believed, this is what I like, it says that they didn't believe Jonah. It says they believed God. When they heard Jonah's message, 40 days and you'll be overthrown, it says they believed God, not Jonah. Do you see how when we hear the message of God, it's not hearing the words of another person, it's hearing the Spirit of God through them. And when they did that, they repented, and even the king and everyone in the kingdom, all of their animals, they did not eat. They fasted, and they set themselves aside to be repentant and to turn back to God. And God saw. In verse 10 at the end of this chapter, it says, when God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil ways, it says that God relented from the disaster that he said he would do, and he did not do it. The word that's used there is another word for turn or to change. It's the word in the Hebrew, it's shub. And it means to turn back or to go to that place of restoration. I think all of us at times, we need to shub back to God. You see, they heard the word that they would be destroyed, that they would be overturned, but they heard the spirit of shub, to go back to God. You know, there's two things in this passage that I think we all need to hear clearly. We need to pay attention to, and in fact, we need to direct our attention to. First of all, we need to ask ourselves the question, what are the things that we're doing halfway? What are the things that we're just barely getting by? What are the things that we're just kind of doing if we need to, or think that we should just enough? Like me cutting corners, mowing the yard, going as fast as I could, even though I knew that my dad wanted every blade cut. What are the things that we're just doing just enough to get by? Because we don't give it the amount of importance that God gives it. If God were to look at you and look you in the eye and say, go back and do it again, what would he be saying that about? I think we need to ask ourselves these questions. If we're really seeking God with all of our heart, our soul, our strength, our mind, we need to ask ourselves, God, how am I like Jonah? How am I cutting corners? How am I running from you? How am I neglecting the people that you've called me and sent me to? Change my heart, God. And send me to those very people, the people that you love that maybe I don't like. God, help me be more diligent with the task that you've given me. The second thing I think we need to consider is if we relate more to the Ninevites, if we relate to those who are struggling or they're going the wrong direction or their life is consumed by other passions, what's it going to take for us to turn back to God? Whose voice will we have to hear? Will we wait for 40 days? I don't know about you, but to me, this whole story of Jonah, I think it should hit home. Because I know most of us, I know myself, I've struggled at times going the opposite direction, just thinking, God, that's not who I want to go to. God, that's not where I want to be. God, that's not something that I care about. But then I hear the voice of God saying, yes, but I do. So go back and do it again. I invite you to think this week about those things. Those things that are important to God, that you've kind of put on the shelf. Because God's inviting you to turn back, to go over and do them again. To do them right. Would you pray with me?